What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Every war eventually reaches a phase where the battlefield stops being the only place where pressure builds. Decisions begin stacking up elsewhere, in offices, in capitals, in diplomatic corridors, where deadlines are floated like weekend dinner plans, and hope is still carefully rationed. Well, Ukraine is now living in that phase. On one side, a young defense minister is trying to rebuild a system while shells, drones and manpower shortages continue to dictate reality. On the other, foreign capitals are quietly circling a familiar catchphrase that has appeared and disappeared countless times over the past years. Well, you already know which phrase this is, the peace talks. But this time the calendar matters. A possible June deadline is being whispered, hinted at, half confirmed, half denied. Not because the war has suddenly become easier to resolve, but because political clocks elsewhere are ticking. And whenever that happens, expectations rise again, often detached from the conditions on the ground. So while one part of Ukraine's leadership is racing to fix command chains, technology gaps and trust between the state and the military, another conversation is unfolding in parallel. A conversation about timing, optics, and whether peace means anything beyond just a headline. To understand whether this moment is different or just another loop, we need to take a look at how internal reform collides with external pressure, and why June may be more about politics than resolution. For most people watching Ukrainian politics, the defense reshuffle came out of nowhere. The previous minister had not even finished unpacking his boxes. On paper, there was no obvious crisis that demanded an immediate swap, but wars are not run on paper. They are run on momentum, perception, and panic management. Behind closed doors, frustration had been building. Not dramatic, headline-grabbing frustration, but the quiet kind that accumulates when systems do not talk to each other, when frontline needs take too long to translate into decisions, and when responsibility floats without clear ownership. From President Zelensky's point of view, something was not working just fast enough. And when speed becomes the priority, technocrats suddenly look very attractive. New defense minister Fedorov was not groomed for this role. He did not campaign for it, he did not circle it like a career climber. And that, paradoxically, made him even more appealing. He came in as someone associated with delivery, not tradition, with action, not ceremony. To exhausted officers, that mattered more than rank or seniority. Reactions inside the military spill almost instantly along generational lines. Younger, tech-oriented officers saw opportunity. Older, conservative commanders saw intrusion. Not because they disliked Fedorov personally, but because his presence implied scrutiny. It implied measurement and comparison, and possibly even consequences. There was also an unspoken tension hanging in the air. If the minister is here to drive change, what does that mean for the commander-in-chief? Is this reinforcement or is this a countdown clock? Some believe performance reviews are coming. Others believe that the president is simply trying to inject speed into a system that has learned to move very cautiously, way too cautiously. Well, either way, Fedorov's arrival sent a very clear message. Standing still is no longer acceptable. And with that shockwave rippling through the ranks, attention quickly shifted from why he arrived to how he intended to operate, which naturally brings us to the philosophy he carried into the building, something we should unpack in more details in our next chapter. And yes, guys, I do know about this dirt on my camera. I promise I'll clean it. So yeah, from day one, Fedorov made it clear that he had no interest in being a passive minister. Procurement alone was not going to cut it. Oversight without authority was not his style. He spoke openly about broken chains of command, blurred accountability, and a difference in a defense ecosystem that functioned more like a collection of cells rather than a single organism. His solution sounded deceptively simple. Measure everything. That's pretty much it. Run performance transparently, let data drive decisions. Create a single operational brain for drones, logistics, and battlefield feedback. In theory, it's exactly what a modern military should do, while in practice, war resists neat categorization. On the tech side, Fedorov is clearly in his element. He understands airspace saturation, the expanding danger zones near the front lines, and why traditional systems struggle against cheap, numerous threats. He talks about volume over elegance, about accessibility over perfection. He knows that something affordable and widely available often matters more than something impressive but rare. He also moved quickly to fix small but corrosive problems: distribution bottlenecks, paperwork delays, communication gaps between units and the state. For too many soldiers, even these minor improvements felt like fresh air after years of improvisation and silence. But here's the catch. Metrics create incentives, and incentives shape behavior. Units that score will tend to get attention, resources, and praise, but not all units are built the same. Some hold static lines, some absorb pressure, some do the unglamorous work of endurance rather than visible impact. And those realities do not always translate cleanly into numbers. So obviously there is a quiet concern among frontline personnel that data-heavy systems may reward visibility over responsibility. That speed might come at the cost of coordination, that competition may replace cooperation. Fedorov knows that this risk exists, obviously, and whether he can balance efficiently with fairness remains an open question. But still, his approach has already shifted the conversation. The ministry is no longer just a supply warehouse, it is trying to become a command nerve. And once you pull on that thread, you inevitably start changing who gets hurt and who gets sidelined, which leads us directly into the controversial circle of advisors he chose to bring with him. Something we definitely should talk about in our next chapter. Nothing sparked louder debate than Fedorov's advisory picks. Not generals, not retired officials, but activists, technical specialists, and people whose credibility was forged outside official structures. To critics, it looked absolutely reckless. To supporters, finally, long overdue. Serhiy Sternenko and Serhiy Flash Beskresnov are not symbols of bureaucracy. They are symbols of wartime improvisation. They represent the parallel supply chains, knowledge networks, and feedback loops that keep units operational when official channels lagged behind reality. Their inclusion was not accidental, it was an admission. For years, volunteers and independent specialists filled gaps the state could not or would not close fast enough. They listened to soldiers, they adapted quickly, they learned by doing. That does not make them perfect, but it makes them at least relevant. What's striking is that frontline reactions to these advisors are overwhelmingly pragmatic. Not ideological, not personal. Soldiers care about whether drones arrive, whether they work, and whether feedback is taken seriously. By that measure, these civilian-linked networks have been delivered. Beskresnov's role highlights another also uncomfortable truth. Innovation cycles in war are brutally short. As soon as one advantage appears, countermeasures follow as soon as possible. Staying ahead requires anticipation, not reaction. And anticipation requires listening to people who obsess over future threats, not just current ones. By inviting these voices inside the ministry, Fedorov is not replacing the military, he is challenging it. For some commanders, that feels like a loss of control. For others, it feels like support finally reaching the right level. This reshuffling of influence does not just affect procurement or technology. It reshapes who gets promoted, who gets trusted, and who gets the authority. And once that process starts, it inevitably spills beyond internal reform into the external arena, where deadlines and diplomacy begin to collide, which brings us to the final chapter of today's video. Alongside internal reform, another narrative has quietly resurfaced. A possible June deadline to move the war towards some sort of resolution. The timing is not accidental. Political calendars outside Ukraine are tightening, and when elections loom, wars suddenly become very inconvenient. Hints from Kyiv suggest that new rounds of talks may be on the table, possibly hosted in the United States, possibly framed as even trilateral discussions. The language is very cautious, deliberately vague. Participations are confirmed, expectations are not. The key question is not whether talks will happen, they almost certainly will. The question is whether they will mean anything. History offers very little encouragement, unfortunately. Previous rounds produced dramatic headlines, carefully staged handshakes, and lengthy conversations, followed by silence and unchanged realities on the ground. Nothing fundamental has shifted since then, as you guys unfortunately all know. Moscow's objectives remain maximalist. Ukraine's red lines remain firm. External mediators are constrained by their own domestic pressures. Deadlines imposed from outside rarely align with battlefield logic. There is also a risk embedded in the optics. Announcing timelines creates an impression of inevitability. That impression can distort planning, fuel false hope, or encourage stalling tactics. If one side believes that time pressure benefits them, progress slows rather than accelerates. Zelensky himself has been careful not to oversell the moment. His remarks suggest awareness that deadlines serve foreign political needs more than Ukrainian security needs. And the subtext is very clear. Peace cannot be scheduled like just a campaign event. Meanwhile, the war continues to grind on unaffected by calendars. Energy infrastructure remains vulnerable, attacked pretty much every single day. Economic pressure inside Russia is growing, but, well, it's growing uneven. None of this translates into neatly readiness to compromise, which means June may arrive with meetings, statements, and speculation, but, once again, unfortunately, without substance. Not because diplomacy is useless, but because diplomacy without leverage and alignment becomes just pure theater. And Ukraine, having seen this play before, is very unlikely to mistake staging for substance. As these external pressures mount, they feed back into internal reform, raising the stakes for people like Fedorov, who must prepare for endurance, not illusions, a reality that frames the conclusion. Ukraine is standing at the intersection of two clocks. One is internal, driven by urgency, adaptation, and survival. The other is external, driven by elections, optics, and impatience. The danger lies in confusing one for another. Fedorov's mission is not to wait for peace. It is to make endurance possible, to shorten feedback loops, to reduce waste, to rebuild trust between the state and those carrying the burden. Whether talks happen in June or not does not change that task. If negotiations do produce miraculously some real movement, Ukraine will need strength to secure it. If they collapse into familiar theatrics, Ukraine will need resilience to outlast them. Either way, reform cannot pose for diplomacy. Deadlines come and go, headlines fade, systems remain. And the outcome will be shaped less by conference rooms rather than by whether Ukraine can align its leadership, its military, and its society around a reality that refuses shortcuts. That is the uncomfortable truth behind the June narrative, and it's one worth remembering. Well, there you have it, guys. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. If you wish to support our work, the links down below, for example, Patreon memberships, where you'll be able to see an additional chapter at the end of each episode. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow. We do not believe